Hello everyone. For today we will talk about the legal and ethical matters relating to scripting. Here's my outline. Notice I start out with the main issues, and throughout the course I've encouraged you to go to the primary source for questions. That's why I'm starting with the biblical principles, because that should be the primary source for Christian professionals. I have a couple of secular references there, then we talk about the assignments. Okay, main issues with scripting is the question of intellectual property, mainly to share in a code. Both the rules as you use others' code and then the question about what happens when somebody uses your code. There's also some primary privacy concerns, and the privacy concerns are from the fact that scripting is very powerful and can be used to tie a number of systems together. So, without any further ado, we'll jump into it. Okay, talk about intellectual property. It'll be useful to define it first. And here's from Merriam-Webster. Source code certainly applies here. Source code would be considered a type of intellectual property. Now, one thing about that, they say any song that you write is your intellectual property. Well, it turns out that you do not have to put the little C on something for it to be copyright. That is implicitly copyrighted unless you say otherwise. So contrary to popular belief, just because it's on the internet does not mean you can copy it any way you want to. Now, in my case, I wasn't worried about any song I wrote, because after playing it for a few people, I realized that I'm not going to worry about anybody trying to make a billion-dollar record with it. Your source code may be quite different. Okay, some of the aspects of intellectual property, there are types of it. You have copyrights, which is basically what you are dealing with for source code. You have patents, where if you invent that cheap printer with the never-ending supply of ink, you'd want to patent it. You also have trade secrets and other types of intellectual properties. One of the things that you may have to sign if you go to work for a company is an intellectual property agreement that anything that you come up with while you're on their dime belongs to them. Okay, talk about the abuse of intellectual property. You basically have misappropriation, where you say that it's your own when it's not. You got misuse, where you use it for something it wasn't intended. Okay, and while I go through these, I will include some Bible quotes. The Bible quotes are from the Bible Gateway. You have the link there, and I'm using the ESV translation. Bible Gateway is a wonderful resource. If you haven't used it, I'd encourage you to take a look at it, see if it's something you can use. Okay, misappropriation is you basically take somebody else's work and say it's yours. If you do that deliberately, I think the Bible's fairly clear on that. One of the commandments. And here's another commandment, and you're saying, well, how am I bearing false witness against my neighbor? If you publish this, particularly if you publish this for a profit motive, then you are legally representing that as your work. And you say, well, this guy's halfway around the world, he's not my neighbor. Well, Jesus provided an expansion of that one in the tale of the Good Samaritan. Well, what if I didn't mean to do it? Well, there is a legal principle that says ignorance of the law is no excuse. If you drive through Cottageville at 70 miles an hour, they're not going to listen to the fact that you didn't see the sign. There's also, in God's law, there is a precedent for this, because they talk about if you sin unintentionally, and there are certain sacrifices and provisions for that. And as it turned out, I believe this is King Josiah, that they had been drifting away from the Bible for so long that they basically lost it, and they found it and said, oh my gosh, we're not doing all these things, and they went and did them. Now that was good, and the Lord considered that, but what's even better is to know the rules before you start, so you don't get in trouble to start with. Okay, misuse. You may properly attribute everything, and you may have all of that, but you may be using the code for something it is not intended to be used for. For extreme example, if you use it for evil and it's meant for good, you have something in Proverbs about that evil not depart from your house. If it's something that what you're using it for is not really evil, but it's not really the original intention of it, you have the thing from 1 Corinthians, which basically talks about your Christian witness. Now, in this particular point, Paul is talking about meat sacrificed to idols, which didn't mean anything to him, and he would just go ahead and eat it, but it might have been a stumbling block to his brothers, and there was quite a discussion about that. Okay, some examples. Sci-Gen is a product of some MIT students, and it actually automatically produces a scientific paper for publication in the scientific journal. It's nonsense and it's gibberish. Their original intent for that was to show some people how poor their review cycle works, because it never would call the person out and say, hey, what does all this mean? There are people that are using these to actually get things published. That would be an example of using something that's for good and using it for evil. They're using it for fraud. Okay, Napster, when it first started out, is just an idea of, hey, I'm going to share some of my music. Well, it turned out the reason I have a question mark about it is that the music companies brought a copyright violation against them, and they were successful. Napster is kind of an example of what I call free. There should be no restrictions on anything on the internet, particularly when it comes to computer code, that it should all freely be shared. Well, there again, you have the case that you may believe that, but if you have people that don't believe that and they believe it's fraud when that you do that, what kind of a Christian witness are you presenting when you ignore that? Okay, then for you cybersecurity people, you have the idea of network security tools that a lot of times the intent is what really governs what you're using it for. I've used Wireshark before to determine exactly what the packets were from from one of my own servers to determine why it wasn't authenticating. I've used Loftcrack to determine how easily my passwords were cracked. That is a perfectly legitimate use for these, but yeah, as you can see, you could also use these to actually hack into somebody's network. Now, this may be important to you because as a cybersecurity professional, you may develop software such as I did that analyzes for defects. Well, you can use that to either make your defenses stronger, or you can use that to break into somebody else's defense. It's important for you to know how to protect yourself legally so that if somebody goes off and uses your code for something that's not supposed to be, that people don't come after you. Okay, talk about privacy through a Christian lens, and instead of boring you with a definition this time, I will bore you with a personal story. I was enlisted before I was an officer, and when I was enlisted, they published a honorable discharge for me because I had to take a discharge and then re-enlist as a officer. Now you notice there's this big ugly blot in the middle of it, and the question is what's that doing there? Well, that was my social security, because back then your social security number was your service number, and it was on all over your official documents, all over your awards, and in fact, according to the Geneva Convention, you were required to give it to your enemy. That was okay back in 1982. Really doesn't make much sense in 2021. Okay, so what is the risk from scripting? The risk from scripting is that scripts can tap into multiple databases very quickly, and if you're not careful, you can spew that all over the internet before you know what you're doing. Okay, here's the biblical references for keeping people's secrets. And notice that in Proverbs they have a couple of things about keeping confidence, and that if you don't, it brings shame upon you, and your ill repute has no end. There again, we come to the point of all things are permitted, but not all things are useful. What would your Christian witness be like if people know you can't keep a secret? Okay, I mentioned writing network defense software and protecting yourself in case it becomes abused. Here's a reference on self-protection. Now, this was in context of Jesus sending out the disciples to witness for him. This is still applicable for the Christian professional. We are still a sheep in the midst of wolves, so we still need to be wise as serpents. Notice they said wise as serpents. To me, that's specifically wise in the ways of the world. But you're still supposed to be innocent of dove. You're still supposed to be harmless. Okay, here's a summary. You have the problems, you have the defenses, you have the references. You say, well, Mr. O'Neill, you have not covered these defenses. No, I didn't. This is the transition into the next part of the presentation. Here are your defenses against the threats we talked about. For legal protection, we had the Privacy Act in 1974. That was one of the first privacy legislation to pass. It's an interesting story when it passed. It turned out it was in 1974, 1975, which was just after we had lost a long war and just after the government had been discovered invading people's privacy. The GDPR is relatively new, but it's very stringent. It's useful for you as a professional to know about that. In addition to that, you got various license agreements that will be the subject of your ethics paper, and we have copyright and patent laws. Now, for Code of Ethics, we have the Bible. I didn't include a hyperlink there because you should have your own copy. I've got the Association of Computer Machinery Code of Ethics and the Institute of Electric and Electronics Engineers Code of Ethics. And you say, why am I showing you these Code of Ethics? Well, that will be part of your assignment. You have two assignments. For the GDPR, I'm thinking about 1 to 3 paragraphs, and you're prepping the boss. It's like the boss come by and say, hey, I got to go into this meeting. We might talk about the GDPR. I have no idea what it is. Prepare your boss as if he doesn't know what it is, and he may have to talk to his boss about it. Okay, for the ethics paper, this is basically what computer ethics means to you as a scripter. Prepare that as if you were sending the paper up to your corporate headquarters for some sort of convention. And I said, do not assume a Christian audience. Feel free to include your faith on this ethics, but do not do like I had one student that did, and their basic thesis was that we don't need any of these other code of ethics. We have the Bible, and it's complete. The Bible is certainly a complete code of moral ethics and much more, but there were two problems. First of all is they never explained what the biblical code of ethics was, and the second thing is they included no scripture reference. The Bible is like a parachute in that it works better when it's open. So if you feel free to include biblical references and Christian references into your paper. Just make sure that you reference them properly. So with that, I will turn you loose on the GDPR and ethics paper, and I am looking forward to the results of both of them.